You'll remember from our last module that there was great prosperity during the Gothic period in the 12th and 13th centuries. But towards the end of this period, as we enter the 14th century, or as we call it in Italy, the Trecento, which is really a period that is a precursor to the Renaissance, there are many problems. There is a lot of crisis that come out of the prosperity of the Gothic era. This prosperity led to overpopulation and food shortages, which led to famine and protests, peasant protests and uprisings. Up in the northern part of Italy, in France and England, we have the 100 Years' War, and then the Black Death, or the plague, which spread throughout Europe and devastated the population. And then finally, we have the Great Schism, which was a strain on the Catholic Church and showed that sort of the cracks in the foundation of the church, which would lead eventually to the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in the 15th and 16th centuries. So I just wanted to remind you of these very important problems as we move forward. We are going to be shifting our focus from France to Italy and thinking about some of the considerations of the 13th century that are going to lead us into the Renaissance. At this time, Italy was a country, but not unified. It was more of a compilation of small city-states with surrounding territories. These areas were dominated by a city, for example, the Duchy of Milan up here, or the Republic of Venice over here. And the political character of these cities or governments was an oligarchy that was ruled by selected aristocrats. Rome existed as a papal state and as a secular state. The Pope was not only the spiritual leader of Europe, but he was also a secular ruler. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice controlled the maritime lanes between Europe and the very rich East. So essentially, going east, we have some very wealthy trade routes. Guilds emerged in the 12th century in France as powerful entities, and so the same occurred in Italy. Guilds became major patrons of the arts, as well as setting regulations which controlled the operations within the guilds. In Italy, we have much of the same context that we do in France. Tremendous prosperity in the 13th century gave way to crisis by the middle of the 14th century. We have that population boom of the 13th century, and food reserves couldn't recover. In Italy, we also have some very bad harvests that led to famines. Black Death spread throughout the Italian peninsula, and a plague outbreak in the 14th century devastated major cities. This was particularly devastating in Italy because the cities of Italy were very crowded and people lived very close together. And so, as we all know, pandemics spread in high population areas. The political issues of the Great Schism were extremely hard felt, obviously, in Rome. And the papacy, although very powerful, vied for control over the church with a French pope over here in Avignon, who had been elected in 1309 and moved the papacy to Avignon. The Italians very much disagreed about this, and they had their own pope in Rome. And this schism lasted from 1378 to 1417. It's against this background of crises that the early Renaissance emerged. So what do these changes mean for the arts? We were already seeing some pretty significant changes, even within the same structure, when we looked at Chartres during your Gothic module. You saw jam figures on the different portals of Chartres, showing a shift in approach of statuary. For example, looking at the west portal, the jam figures of biblical kings and queens, we saw elongated, abstracted, stylized figures in which the verticality is really emphasized. They seem to float in midair and seem to be otherworldly, distant from the physical world. In a matter of a century later, on the south portal, the jam figure of St. Theodore, for example, shows a very different approach, a shift towards that materiality of the past of the Greek and Roman statuary. The figure seems to be almost standing in contrapposto, and his feet, rather than floating, seem to be physically grounded on a pedestal here. He seems very much of the material physical world and appears to be wanting to almost step off of his pedestal. He's not quite 3D. He's not a freestanding figure. He's still attached to the architectural background, but we definitely are seeing a difference in approach. In other jam figures, the figures seem to be almost interacting with one another. We don't see that distance of the west portal figures, but rather figures that seem to be wanting to interact with the physical world, with each other, and even us as the audience. There is a somewhat different approach in Italy, and this is the place where the Renaissance blossoms. What does the term Renaissance denote? Of course, it means the rebirth, and it suggests a revival of interest in Greek and Roman texts and culture, which began in the 14th century. Rome is the logical place for such a resurgence because of its direct connection to Rome and the examples of antiquity that literally surrounded the artists of this time. I'm showing you here a high relief from a baptistry pulpit, which is a kind of box where a priest would give a sermon. And we see here in the Annunciation and Nativity, the figure of Mary has tremendous monumentality and has a central position that evokes her connections with an earth goddess of antiquity. It almost looks like the relief from a Roman sarcophagus. Nicholas Pisano is also drawing on imperial reliefs, especially the draperies that provide movement and figures in space. We could compare it, for example, to the Ara Pacis and the processional frieze, in which we see all of this tremendous drapery, people interacting with one another, and a monumentality that was typical of imperial Rome. Pisano gained exposure to classical art through the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, who used classical antiquity for his own purposes. Pisano also would have had contact with Roman sculpture and prototypes that were available in Pisa and in Rome at this time. If we move forward just a generation, looking at a pulpit relief by Giovanni Pisano, Nicola's son, there is more drama, more emotion, more movement, and there's less emphasis on a heavy monumentality. Although Giovanni carried on his father's interest in naturalistic details, he did not continue with the interest in classical forms in a very direct way. He shifted from this heavy classicism to a more animated style where we have slender figures and show the heavy curving line of Gothic art. So this is to say that the Gothic style does not die out during this period, but we have an introduction of classical models as well. But the huge Gothic architectural projects slowed during the 14th century. This is because there was less labor. People died out during the plague, and this devastated the building industry. The plague was a very visible devastation by the middle of the 14th century, and this led to a new orientation towards humanity. Remember that death is very prominent at this time. Everyone would have seen and felt the devastation of the plague. As much as 60% of the population was wiped out by this, so everyone would have been affected. And there was this idea that death was the great equalizer. The plague affected people no matter what their class and no matter what their position. There was also a emphasis on societal needs and outreach to the people suffering. Hospitals were established by religious orders to care for not just the soul, but the body as well, because there was real suffering that affected everyone. And this is kind of a new thing for religion. There was a concern for mortality and suffering and alleviating that suffering on this earth rather than looking forward to the afterlife. And again, this relates to an idea of humanism, which is a social philosophy in which human interests, values, and dignity predominate. This is a worldview that focused on the here and now, on the earthbound, on human beings. And it is underpinned by an educational system that perfected individuals through the study of past models of civic and personal virtue. So it's looking back to human accomplishments. Specifically, it looked back on examples from antiquity. And this is when we see a resurgence of the naturalism of the Greek and Roman period in art. Guilds were very important organizational associations during the medieval period, but they continue to be very powerful during the Renaissance. They are associations of craftspeople, so this could be fabric weavers, textile makers, silk producers, woodworkers, metal workers, painters, sculptors, various different professional organizations. They set the standards and controlled the selling and marketing of its members' products. So they were essentially in charge of quality control for their profession. They also provided economic protections for its members. And they created group solidarity through organizing social events like festivals and religious places like chapels that were dedicated to the craftspeople. They each had a patron saint. For example, St. Luke was the patron saint of the Guild of Painters. And they oversaw education and apprenticeships. So they allowed for a system in which someone could rise through the ranks of their craft. For painters, they needed to serve in an apprenticeship, and then they would need to pass an exam and create a masterpiece for entrance into the guild.